Welcome back to the Wild West Vault. If you love stories of faith, second chances, courageous women, heartwarming families, and wholesome romance from the Old West, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who believes God can still restore broken hearts. Now, settle in as we travel to the Montana Territory, where one little girl's simple words would begin changing a man's life forever. Montana Territory, autumn of 1888. The morning sun climbed slowly over the Rocky Mountains, painting the endless prairie in soft shades of gold. Frost still clung to the tall grass, sparkling like tiny diamonds as cowboys rode across the open range. The cool wind carried the smell of pine, fresh earth, and wood smoke drifting from scattered homesteads. Most ranches greeted the morning with cheerful voices. The Walker Ranch did not. It was one of the largest cattle operations in the territory, stretching farther than most travelers could see in a day's ride. Hundreds of cattle grazed peacefully across the rolling hills. Strong horses filled the corrals. Well-built barns stood proudly against the sky. The ranch had everything a man could dream of. Everything except joy. Its owner, Elias Walker, stepped out onto the porch before sunrise as he did every single morning. He was a tall man with broad shoulders weathered by years of honest work. A neatly trimmed beard covered part of his face, while streaks of gray had begun appearing around his temples long before their time. He looked much older than his 41 years. Not because of age, because of sorrow. His eyes drifted toward the eastern pasture where the first rays of sunlight touched the land. 7 years. 7 years since laughter had echoed through this house. 7 years since his wife, Rebecca, had smiled at him from this very porch. 7 years since the terrible winter storm that had stolen both her and the unborn son they had prayed for. People said time healed every wound. Elias had stopped believing that. He quietly picked up his hat, settled it on his head, and walked toward the barn. Ben Carter was already saddling horses. Morning, boss. Morning. Ben had worked beside Elias for nearly 15 years. He remembered the days when the ranch owner laughed louder than anyone around the campfire, played harmless tricks on the younger cowboys, and sang old hymns while repairing fences. That man seemed to have disappeared. Nowadays Elias spoke only when necessary. He worked harder than everyone else. He expected excellence. He showed kindness. But happiness had become something he believed belonged to other people. Ben watched his friend mount his horse. The south fence needs checking. I'll handle it. The new calves look healthy. A simple nod. Nothing more. Ben sighed quietly after Elias rode away. He still carries that storm inside him, he whispered to another ranch hand. The younger cowboy lowered his voice. I've worked here almost 2 years. I've never seen him smile. Ben looked across the open pasture. Neither has anyone else. Several miles away, an old stagecoach creaked along a dusty road toward the small town of Willow Creek. Inside sat Martha Bennett and her 7-year-old daughter, Emily. Everything they owned fit inside 2 worn trunks. A sewing basket. A cast-iron skillet wrapped in cloth. Several quilts. 3 dresses. 1 family Bible with faded leather covers. And hope. Not much else. Emily leaned against the window, watching cattle graze in the distance. Mama? Yes, sweetheart. Do you think this place will like us? Martha smiled gently before answering. I don't know. You always know. No, my darling. She brushed a loose strand of brown hair behind Emily's ear. I only know God brought us this far. Emily nodded as though that explained everything. To a child who trusted the Lord with all her heart. It did. Martha rested her hands in her lap. Those hands had worked endlessly during the past 2 years. They had washed clothes, cooked meals, mended shirts, sewn blankets, cleaned homes, done every honest job she could find after losing her husband, Thomas, in a mining accident. Some days she earned enough to buy supper. Some days she did not. Through every hardship, she had protected Emily from despair as best she could. She smiled even when her own heart broke. She prayed even when answers seemed delayed. She thanked God even when she did not understand His plans. Life had not been easy for Martha. People often noticed her sighs before they noticed her kindness. Some assumed she was lazy. Others believed she lacked discipline. Few knew how little food she herself ate, so Emily would never go hungry. The weight she carried had become another reason strangers judged her before learning her story. She had long ago stopped trying to defend herself. God knew the truth. That was enough. The stagecoach rolled into Willow Creek just before noon. The little town bustled with activity. Blacksmiths hammered glowing steel. Children chased one another down wooden sidewalks. Merchants displayed vegetables, flour, and bolts of cloth. Church bells rang in the distance. Emily smiled brightly. It feels friendly. I hope you're right. Pastor Samuel Brooks greeted every newcomer after Sunday service. His silver hair peeked beneath his hat and laughter lines framed his eyes. When he saw Martha carrying both trunks while helping Emily down from the coach, he immediately walked over. Mrs. Bennett? She smiled. Yes, sir. I've been expecting you. He removed his hat politely. Welcome to Willow Creek. Emily curtsied. Good afternoon, Pastor. He chuckled. Well now, aren't you polite? My mama says manners are free. Pastor Samuel laughed warmly. And she's absolutely right. Within minutes several church ladies gathered nearby. Some welcomed Martha sincerely. Others exchanged quick glances. One whispered quietly enough to think no one heard. She's larger than I expected. Another answered. I wonder if she'll manage ranch work. Martha heard every word. She kept smiling anyway. Emily looked up at her mother. Does it hurt? Martha squeezed her daughter's hand. Only if we let it. What should we do? We love people anyway. Emily nodded. Even when they're unkind? Especially then. Pastor Samuel watched the exchange. He silently thanked God for sending such a woman to their little town. After the church service, Pastor Samuel looked around the gathering. Elias. The rancher turned. I'd like you to meet someone. Elias removed his hat politely as he approached. His expression remained calm but unreadable. Mr. Walker, Pastor Samuel said, this is Mrs. Martha Bennett and her daughter Emily. Martha is looking for honest work. Elias gave a respectful nod. Ma'am? Mr. Walker. The pastor tells me you need a cook. I do. I can cook for large groups. I also bake, preserve vegetables, sew, mend clothing and keep house. Elias appreciated plain speaking. When could you start? If the Lord allows. She smiled gently. Tomorrow morning. Very well. Pastor Samuel smiled. I believe that settles it. While the adults spoke, Emily quietly studied Elias. Children noticed things adults often missed. She didn't see a stern rancher. She saw a lonely man. His clothes were neat. His boots were polished. His voice was steady. But his eyes looked terribly sad. Almost as though they had forgotten what happiness felt like. Emily tugged lightly on her mother's sleeve. Mama. Yes. The cowboy looks broken. Martha blushed. Hush, sweetheart. But he does. Elias had heard every word. To everyone's surprise, he wasn't offended. He simply looked down at the little girl. Emily tilted her head. Did someone make you sad? The churchyard became unusually quiet. No one asked Elias personal questions. Ever. He answered softly. A long time ago. Emily thought carefully. Then she nodded as though she understood. My daddy went to heaven. Elias's eyes softened almost imperceptibly. I'm sorry. I miss him. I know. She smiled anyway. But Mama says when people belong to Jesus, goodbye isn't forever. Pastor Samuel lowered his head. Even Ben Carter, standing nearby, felt emotion rising in his chest. Emily took another small step closer. Then she looked up at Elias with complete confidence. You forgot something. His eyebrows lifted slightly. What did I forget? How to smile. Several people exchanged nervous glances. Agnes Turner nearly gasped. Someone coughed into his sleeve. Nobody breathed. Emily pointed toward her mother with complete certainty. But that's all right. She beamed. My mama can fix that. Silence spread across the churchyard. Even the horses seemed still. Martha covered her face with embarrassment. Oh, Emily. I'm sorry, Mr. Walker. She only speaks what she's thinking. Elias looked from the child to her mother. For one brief moment, something flickered behind his tired eyes. Not quite happiness. Not yet. Perhaps curiosity. Perhaps hope. He placed his hat back on his head. I'll expect you at sunrise tomorrow, Mrs. Bennett. Yes, sir. He turned toward his horse. Mounted quietly. Rode a few yards away. Then, without looking back, he said something no one expected. Children usually see things adults miss. It was the longest sentence anyone had heard Elias Walker speak in weeks. Pastor Samuel watched him disappear down the dusty road. A gentle smile crossed the old pastor's face. The Lord often sends healing in unexpected packages. He looked down at Emily. I believe, young lady, that God has just given you a very important assignment. Emily slipped her tiny hand into her mother's. I didn't do anything. Pastor Samuel smiled knowingly. Oh, I think you just did. Far across the prairie, Elias continued riding home. The wind rushed softly around him. For the first time in many years, another thought interrupted the grief that had lived in his heart for so long. My mama can fix that. He shook his head slightly. It was a child's innocent remark. Nothing more. Yet somehow, it echoed louder than the memories he had carried for 7 long years. And though he would never admit it aloud, something inside the lonely rancher had shifted. Only a little. Just enough for God to begin his work. The first light of dawn had barely touched the Montana sky when Martha Bennett opened her eyes. For a moment she lay still, listening. The little boarding room was quiet except for the gentle breathing of Emily, who slept peacefully beneath a handmade quilt. Outside, a rooster crowed somewhere across town, followed by the distant rumble of wagon wheels rolling over the dirt road. Martha smiled. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered softly. "Thank you for another day. Help me serve with willing hands and a joyful heart. Let everything I do today bring honor to you." She quietly slipped from bed, dressed in a plain blue calico dress, tied a clean white apron around her waist, and braided her chestnut brown hair. Before waking Emily, she knelt beside the bed and opened the worn family Bible that had traveled with them from Helena. Her eyes rested on a familiar verse. "Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men." She smiled. "I'll remember that today." Emily stirred awake. "Are we going to the Cowboy's ranch?" Martha laughed softly. "Yes, sweetheart." "Do you think he smiled while he slept?" "I don't know. I prayed that he would." Martha leaned over and kissed her daughter's forehead. "Then perhaps God heard your prayer." "I know he did." Children often spoke with a certainty that adults spent years trying to recover. The Walker Ranch was already alive when they arrived. Cowboys hurried toward the corrals. Horses stamped their hooves impatiently. The smell of fresh hay mixed with the cool morning air. Ben Carter spotted them first. "Morning, Mrs. Bennett." "Good morning." He tipped his hat toward Emily. "And good morning to you." Emily grinned. "I remembered your name." "You did. You're Mr. Ben." He laughed. "I reckon that's right." Ben picked up one of Martha's trunks before she could protest. "Kitchen's this way." As they walked across the yard, several ranch hands looked toward the newcomers. Some smiled politely. Others whispered. One young cowboy muttered quietly enough that he thought Martha wouldn't hear. "I don't reckon she's ever worked a ranch before." Another shrugged. "She doesn't look built for ranch life." Ben stopped walking. He turned toward both men. "You know what I see?" They looked uncomfortable. "I see a widow trying to provide for her little girl." Silence. "I'd advise both of you to remember your mothers taught better manners than that." The young cowboys lowered their eyes. "Sorry, ma'am." Martha smiled kindly. "No offense taken." Ben looked at her in surprise. "You truly aren't upset?" "Oh, I've learned something over the years." "What's that?" "People usually speak from what's inside their own hearts." Ben nodded thoughtfully. He had expected bitterness. Instead he found grace. The ranch house stood proudly on a small rise overlooking the valley. Its sturdy log walls had weathered countless winters. It was beautiful, but it felt empty. As Ben opened the front door, the silence inside seemed almost heavy. Dust rested along the windowsills. The curtains hung faded and crooked. A rocking chair sat untouched beside the fireplace. The clock on the mantel had stopped long ago. Nothing was broken. Nothing was neglected. Yet nothing felt alive. Emily looked around carefully. "It sounds lonely." Ben sighed. "It is." Martha slowly walked through the kitchen. Everything had its place. The shelves were organized. The cookware was clean. Still, the room lacked warmth. No fresh herbs hung from the ceiling. No bread cooled on the windowsill. No flowers brightened the table. No laughter echoed from the walls. It looked like a kitchen. It no longer felt like the heart of a home. Martha quietly set down her basket. Without making a single comment, she rolled up her sleeves. "May I begin?" Ben smiled. "It's your kitchen now." Her first task was simple. She opened every curtain. Golden morning sunlight flooded the room. Dust danced through the beams of light. Emily laughed. "The sunshine found us." Martha smiled. "Sometimes that's the first step." She opened the windows. Fresh autumn air swept through the house. The stale scent of loneliness slowly disappeared beneath the fragrance of pine trees carried by the breeze. Then she began unpacking. A small bundle of dried rosemary, sage, thyme, a loaf of homemade sourdough she had baked before sunrise, a jar of blackberry preserves. fresh apples, cinnamon. Emily arranged wildflowers she had gathered along the road into an old pitcher. There. She stepped back proudly. It looks happy. Martha smiled. I think you're right. By noon, wonderful smells drifted across the ranch. Roasted chicken, fresh biscuits, creamy potato soup, apple pie cooling beside the window. The ranch hands noticed immediately. One sniffed the air. What's that smell? Another grinned. Heaven. Even the horses seemed curious. When the dinner bell rang, the men entered the dining room expecting another ordinary meal. Instead they stopped in the doorway. The long wooden table looked different. Fresh flowers stood in the center. Clean cloth napkins rested beside every plate. Warm bread waited in baskets. Steam rose from bowls of soup. One cowboy whispered, I haven't seen this table look like this since Mrs. Rebecca. The room became quiet. Ben glanced toward Elias. The ranch owner said nothing. He simply took his usual seat. Martha served everyone before serving herself. Emily helped carry biscuits. One by one, the ranch hands tasted the meal. Eyes widened. Someone closed his eyes in appreciation. Another reached for a second biscuit before finishing the first. Finally Ben laughed. Mrs. Bennett? Yes. I've worked here 15 years. I've never tasted better biscuits. Several men nodded enthusiastically. One younger cowboy raised his hand. May I have another? Emily giggled. I think that's a yes. Even Elias noticed something. Conversation had returned to the table. Men who usually ate in silence were telling stories again. Someone laughed. Another shared news about a newborn calf. For the first time in years, the dining room sounded alive. After lunch, Martha quietly began cleaning. She mended a loose curtain hem. She polished the old mantel clock. Although it no longer worked, she dusted it carefully. She stitched a torn table runner instead of throwing it away. Emily wandered through the house, humming softly as she gathered colorful autumn leaves. She arranged them beside the fireplace. When Elias returned from inspecting the western pasture, he paused inside the doorway. Something felt different. He couldn't explain it. The air smelled like fresh bread instead of cold ashes. The windows were open. Sunlight reached corners of the house he hadn't noticed in years. Even the silence sounded different. It was no longer heavy, only peaceful. He walked into the kitchen. Martha looked up from kneading bread. Good afternoon, Mr. Walker. He nodded. The men seemed pleased. I'm grateful. You cook well. Thank you. He noticed Emily carefully placing another handful of wildflowers into a pitcher. What are those for? Emily looked surprised by the question. Flowers make lonely places feel loved. Elias stood still. No one had ever answered him like that. I see. She smiled. My mama says little things matter. He looked toward Martha. She simply nodded. They usually do. That evening the ranch hands gathered outside after supper. One cowboy leaned back against a fence. Feels different around here. It surely does. What changed? Ben looked toward the glowing kitchen window where Martha and Emily were washing dishes together. They didn't. We did. The younger men looked confused. Ben smiled. That house always had everything. What it didn't have was someone who remembered it was meant to be a home. Inside, Emily carefully dried the last plate. Mama? Yes. Do you think Mr. Walker is still sad? I do. Can we help? Martha placed the clean dish into the cupboard. We can't erase someone's sorrow. No. No, sweetheart. She gently knelt beside her daughter. But we can remind them they don't have to carry it alone. Emily thought about that for a moment. So, we just keep loving people? Exactly. Even if they don't smile? Especially then. Emily wrapped her arms around her mother. I like your ideas. Martha laughed. They're not mine. They're God's. Late that night, after everyone else had gone to bed, Elias sat alone on the porch. A lantern glowed beside his chair. The valley stretched before him beneath a blanket of stars. For years, the porch had been a place where memories haunted him. Tonight, something else lingered. The smell of fresh bread still drifted from the kitchen. Soft laughter from earlier echoed faintly in his mind. He looked toward the dining room window. The flowers Emily had gathered sat in the center of the table. Such a small thing. Just wildflowers. Flowers no one else would have bothered picking. Yet somehow they had changed the entire room. He quietly shook his head. Rebecca used to gather flowers. He had forgotten that. No, perhaps he hadn't forgotten. Perhaps he had simply stopped allowing himself to remember the beautiful parts because they always led to the painful ones. For the first time in 7 years, he thanked God for a memory instead of running from it. He bowed his head. His prayer was short. Lord, I don't know what you're doing. The wind stirred gently through the cottonwood trees. But, thank you for today. It was only one sentence. Yet it was the first prayer Elias Walker had prayed from hope instead of heartbreak in many years. Inside the quiet house, the old mantel clock remained broken. But somehow, time had started moving again. God had not rushed into the Walker Ranch with thunder or miracles. He had arrived through fresh bread, open windows, wildflowers, and the faithful hands of a widow who believed that every act of kindness, no matter how small, could become part of his greater plan. And though Elias could not yet see where that plan would lead, the house that had forgotten joy had begun, one gentle day at a time, to remember what home felt like once more. 3 weeks passed like the gentle turning of autumn leaves. By now, nearly everyone at the Walker Ranch had fallen into a new rhythm. The men no longer rushed through meals. Breakfast became a time of laughter instead of silence. Supper often ended with stories from the trail or old memories shared around the long dining table. The ranch itself seemed to breathe differently. Fresh curtains fluttered in the windows. The porch had been swept until the wood shone. Boxes filled with herbs lined the kitchen windowsill. Wildflowers appeared on the table almost every day, thanks to Emily's cheerful determination. If God made flowers, she often said, he probably likes seeing them inside too. No one argued with her. Least of all Elias. Although he still spoke little, the ranch hands noticed changes too small for him to recognize. He no longer hurried away immediately after eating. He lingered on the porch in the evenings. Sometimes he even listened while the younger cowboys swapped stories. He had not laughed. Not yet. But the hard edge that had once surrounded him was beginning to soften. One crisp morning, Martha stood outside hanging freshly washed shirts on a clothesline. Emily skipped nearby, collecting pine cones for a little basket she was making. Ben Carter walked across the yard carrying a saddle. Morning, Mrs. Bennett. Good morning, Ben. He scratched the back of his neck. I wanted to thank you. For what? The men work harder now. Martha looked puzzled. I only cook. Ben smiled. No. You do much more than that. She shook her head gently. I simply try to make people feel welcome. Exactly. He leaned against the fence. When folks feel cared for, they usually become their best selves. Martha looked toward the bunkhouse where several ranch hands were repairing tack together. They've been kind to Emily. They love having her around. Ben chuckled. Yesterday she told Jake that horses listen better if you speak politely. Martha laughed. And did he try it? He surely did. Did it work? Ben grinned. The horse still ignored him. Both of them laughed. Across the yard, Elias noticed. He found himself watching Martha more often than he intended. Not because of her appearance, but because of what happened whenever she entered a room. People relaxed. Arguments settled. Children smiled. Even the animals seemed calmer around her. He couldn't explain it. Only that peace seemed to follow wherever she went. A few days later, Willow Creek prepared for its annual harvest festival. It was the biggest celebration of the year. Families decorated wagons with pumpkins, corn stalks, colorful quilts, and autumn flowers. Children practiced songs for the church choir. The blacksmith announced horseshoe contests. Women prepared pies, preserves, and fresh bread for the community tables. The whole town buzzed with excitement. Emily could hardly contain herself. Mama? What is it? Pastor Samuel says there'll be apple bobbing. I heard. And races. I heard that too. And pie. Martha laughed. I definitely heard about the pie. Emily threw her arms around her mother's waist. It's going to be the best day ever. I hope so. The morning of the festival arrived bright and cool. The church grounds overflowed with wagons, horses, and smiling faces. Children ran through the open field carrying ribbons. Music from a fiddle drifted through the air. Women greeted one another with warm embraces. Pastor Samuel stood near the entrance, welcoming every family. When Elias arrived with Martha and Emily riding in the ranch wagon, several heads turned. Not because a ranch owner had come, but because he had invited Martha and Emily to ride with him. Agnes Turner noticed immediately. She folded her arms. Well, I suppose that's interesting. Another woman leaned closer. You think he's growing fond of her? Agnes looked toward Martha. I cannot imagine why. The women exchanged quiet whispers. Martha pretended not to hear. She had spent too many years listening to opinions that did not matter. Emily noticed anyway. She slipped her small hand into her mother's. Mama? Yes. Some people are staring. I know. Why? Martha smiled gently. Sometimes people judge what they don't understand. Emily frowned. That's silly. It can be. So we still love them? Martha squeezed her hand. Always. The pie competition began first. Long tables overflowed with fresh apple, peach, blackberry and pumpkin pies. Everyone encouraged Martha to enter one of hers. She hesitated. I've never entered a contest. Ben laughed. You've already won. I haven't even baked yet. You don't know these folks. Emily tugged her apron. Please, Mama. So Martha agreed. Her apple pie sat quietly among dozens of others. No fancy decorations. No elaborate crust. Just careful hands and honest ingredients. When the judges finished tasting every pie, Pastor Samuel stepped onto the wooden platform. Ladies and gentlemen, the winner of this year's harvest pie competition. He smiled warmly. Mrs. Martha Bennett. The crowd applauded. Emily jumped up and down. I knew it. Ben clapped louder than anyone. Even Elias smiled with quiet pride. As Martha accepted the blue ribbon, Agnes whispered loudly enough for nearby women to hear. Well, I suppose cooking is easier than walking. A few women laughed. The words sliced through the joyful moment. Emily's smile disappeared. She looked at Agnes with wide, confused eyes. Why would she say that? Martha placed a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. Because sometimes hurting people say hurtful things. But you didn't do anything wrong. I know. Emily looked ready to cry. Before Martha could answer, another voice spoke. It seems some people still measure others by appearances. Everyone turned. Pastor Samuel stepped down from the platform. His calm eyes rested kindly upon Agnes. I've served this town for over 30 years. He smiled gently. And I've learned something. The entire crowd became quiet. The strongest hands are not always the largest. The richest people are not always the wealthiest. And the most beautiful souls are often carried inside the most ordinary faces. He opened the Bible he carried. The Lord does not see as man sees. His voice echoed across the gathering. Man looks on the outward appearance. But the Lord looks on the heart. Silence settled over the church grounds. Pastor Samuel closed the Bible. I have watched Mrs. Bennett for 3 weeks. I have seen her rise before dawn. I have watched her feed hungry men before serving herself. I have watched her comfort children. I have watched her pray for this community. He smiled toward Martha. If beauty is measured by kindness, she is among the loveliest women in this valley. Several people nodded. One ranch wife quietly wiped away a tear. Then something remarkable happened. Ben Carter stepped forward. I'd like to say something. Pastor Samuel nodded. Go ahead. Ben cleared his throat. When Mrs. Bennett came to our ranch, our house looked clean. But it didn't feel alive. He looked toward the crowd. She didn't ask for praise. She simply worked. She remembered birthdays. She baked extra bread for hungry travelers. She patched shirts no one asked her to mend. When one of the boys got sick, she stayed beside him half the night. His voice grew softer. And for the first time in 7 years, our ranch feels like a home again. One by one, the ranch hands stepped beside him. Jake spoke first. She made me believe someone cared whether I came home safe. Another cowboy smiled. She prays before every meal. Now I do too. A third added. She reminds us to write letters to our mothers. Laughter spread through the crowd. Even Agnes lowered her eyes. Emily looked up at her mother with overwhelming pride. I told you everyone would see. Throughout the afternoon, Elias found himself watching Martha from a distance. She spoke kindly to every child. She shared slices of her prize-winning pie with families who had none. When an elderly widow struggled to carry a basket, Martha quietly took it from her without drawing attention. She never seemed to notice who was important, or wealthy, or respected. She simply saw people. That evening, the community gathered for hymns singing beneath strings of lanterns. As voices rose together, the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and crimson. Pastor Samuel invited everyone to hold hands during the final hymn. Without thinking, Emily reached for Elias's hand. Then she reached for Martha's. Their hands met for the briefest moment. Neither spoke. Neither pulled away immediately. As the final verse of Great is Thy Faithfulness drifted across the valley, Elias bowed his head. For years he had thanked God for duty, for strength, for survival. Tonight, another prayer quietly formed within his heart. Lord, thank you for sending kindness back into my life. When the hymn ended, he looked toward Martha. She was laughing softly as Emily tried to balance 3 pumpkins at once. The sound caught him by surprise, not because it was loud, but because he realized something he had not expected. He wanted to hear that laughter again. The realization startled him. 7 years ago, he had buried not only his wife but every dream of loving another woman. He had convinced himself that his heart had nothing left to give. Yet standing beneath the autumn sky, surrounded by neighbors and friends, he began to wonder if God had not been taking something away all those years. Perhaps he had simply been preparing him for something he could not yet see. As the stars appeared over the Montana hills, Pastor Samuel watched the Walker family wagon disappear down the winding road. He smiled quietly to himself. God rarely changed lives in a single dramatic moment. More often he worked through faithful people. A warm meal, a helping hand, a child's innocent faith, a widow's quiet kindness. And little by little, he rebuilt hearts that had once believed they could never be whole again. October slowly gave way to November. The brilliant gold leaves that had covered the cottonwood trees now drifted across the prairie like scattered pieces of sunshine. The mornings grew colder. Frost coated the fence posts before dawn, and every ranch hand knew what those signs meant. Winter was coming. At the Walker Ranch, everyone worked from sunrise until long after dark. Hay had to be stacked. The cattle were moved to sheltered pastures. Firewood was split and neatly piled beside every building. Barn roofs were inspected. Windows were sealed against the bitter winds that would soon sweep down from the mountains. Even little Emily found ways to help. She proudly gathered kindling each afternoon, carrying bundles that were almost as large as she was. One evening, Elias watched her struggling with an armful of sticks. "You don't have to carry all of those." Emily looked up with determination. "I'm helping. I can see that. They're heavy." "I know. So are grown-up problems." Elias blinked. "What do you mean?" Emily smiled as though the answer were obvious. "Mama says if everyone carries a little, nobody has to carry everything." Without another word, Elias bent down and picked up half the bundle. Together they walked toward the house. Neither of them noticed Martha watching from the kitchen window. She smiled softly. The lonely rancher who once avoided everyone was now carrying firewood beside a little girl. It seemed like such a small thing. Yet Martha knew that healing rarely announced itself with great fanfare. Most often it arrived quietly, one choice at a time. That Sunday after church, Pastor Samuel preached from the book of Psalms. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." His voice echoed gently through the small wooden church. There are many kinds of storms. Some fall from the sky. Others settle inside the heart. The first kind eventually passes. The second kind often remains because we convince ourselves we must face it alone. Elias listened without lifting his eyes. Every word seemed directed at him. Beside him, Martha quietly turned the pages of her Bible. She never looked toward Elias. She simply listened. But she silently prayed. "Lord, if his heart is ready, give him the courage to trust you again." 3 days later the weather changed. The morning began calm enough. By noon, dark clouds rolled over the mountains. The wind sharpened. Snowflakes began to drift across the pasture. Ben looked toward the sky and frowned. "I don't like the look of this." Neither did Elias. Within an hour, the gentle snowfall became a blinding storm. The wind howled around the barns. Snow swirled so thickly that the nearest fence disappeared from sight. The temperature dropped with frightening speed. "Move the cattle," Elias shouted. The ranch hands rushed into action. For the next several hours they battled the storm together. Men fought to keep frightened horses calm. They guided cattle toward sheltered corrals. Frozen fingers struggled against ropes stiffened by ice. Snow piled higher with every passing minute. Inside the house, Martha fed the stove until the kitchen grew warm. She prepared hot stew for the men when they returned. Emily stood at the window praying aloud. "Please, Lord, keep everybody safe. Especially Mr. Walker." Late that afternoon the front door burst open. Ben staggered inside, covered from head to toe in snow. "Martha." She hurried toward him. "What happened?" The north fence gave way. Elias stayed behind. "He's searching for 2 missing calves." Martha's face grew pale. "Alone?" Ben nodded. "He ordered the rest of us back. He said the men needed warming before someone froze." Emily looked up immediately. He's still outside? Ben removed his gloves. The storm's getting worse. Without hesitation, Martha filled a basket with blankets, a lantern, dry gloves, and a flask of hot coffee. Ben stared. What are you doing? I'm going. No. He'll never forgive me if I let you. Martha calmly fastened her heavy coat. I'm not asking permission. Emily stepped forward. I want to help too. Martha knelt before her daughter. No, sweetheart. You stay here with Mrs. Jenkins. Emily's eyes filled with concern. Bring him home. I'll do everything I can. Then the little girl wrapped her arms around Martha. And tell him. She hesitated. That God is with him. The wind nearly stole Martha's breath the moment she stepped outside. Snow whipped across the ranch yard, stinging her face like tiny needles. Ben led the way on horseback while Martha rode close behind. Visibility was almost gone. They followed faint tracks through the deepening snow. The storm reminded Elias of another winter. 7 years earlier. The same bitter wind. The same endless white. The same desperate race against time. Rebecca had gone into labor weeks too early. Their nearest doctor lived nearly 20 miles away. He had tried. He had ridden through a storm almost exactly like this one. He never reached him in time. When he returned home, it was too late. His wife and their unborn son were gone. Since that day, every snowstorm carried the sound of his own failure. As the memories crashed over him, Elias suddenly realized he could no longer feel his hands. His horse stumbled. He slipped into the snow. For a moment he closed his eyes. I'm tired, he whispered. So tired. Then through the roaring wind he heard a familiar voice. Mr. Walker. His eyes opened. Martha. The lantern light flickered through the storm. She hurried toward him, kneeling beside him despite the freezing snow. What were you thinking? He managed a weak smile. I was looking for calves. I know. She wrapped the blanket tightly around his shoulders. But now I'm looking for you. Those simple words reached deeper than she realized. For 7 years, no one had come looking for him. Not his heart. Not his grief. Not the lonely man hidden beneath both. She handed him the flask. Drink. He obeyed. The hot coffee warmed more than his frozen body. The ride home was slow. Snow continued falling as they finally reached the ranch house. Emily ran to the porch the moment she saw them. He came back. She threw her arms around Elias before anyone could stop her. He stood frozen. Not from cold. From surprise. Very few people hugged him anymore. Slowly, almost awkwardly, he wrapped one arm around the little girl. I'm all right. I know. I asked Jesus. That evening, after everyone else had gone to bed, Elias remained sitting beside the fireplace. The flames crackled softly. Outside, the storm continued. Martha quietly entered with 2 cups of tea. I thought you might still be awake. I couldn't sleep. She handed him a cup before taking the chair opposite him. For several minutes, neither spoke. Finally, Elias broke the silence. I hate snow. I guessed. It took everything from me. His voice trembled. I still remember every moment. He stared into the fire. I hear Rebecca calling my name. I remember leaving to find the doctor. I remember praying I'd return in time. He closed his eyes. I didn't. Tears gathered for the first time in years. I failed her. The words seemed to echo through the room. Martha listened quietly. She did not interrupt. She did not rush to answer. When he finally finished speaking, the silence lingered. Then she spoke with gentle certainty. You loved her. With all my heart. You tried to save her. I did. You were willing to risk your own life. Yes. She leaned forward slightly. Then why do you believe God blames you for a storm you could not control? Elias had no answer. Martha opened her Bible. Her fingers found the verse almost immediately. There is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. She looked at him. You've spent 7 years carrying guilt. But guilt and grief are not the same. He frowned thoughtfully. What do you mean? Grief is love that has nowhere to go. It reminds us someone mattered. She paused. Guilt tells us we should have been God. The words settled deeply within him. You could not command the weather. You could not stop time. You could not choose life or death. Only the Lord holds those things. Elias bowed his head. His shoulders shook. Not with anger. Not with despair. But with release. The burden he had carried for so long suddenly felt lighter. Not gone. But no longer crushing him. After several moments, Martha stood. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. You don't have to stop loving Rebecca. You never will. But you also don't have to stop living. She turned to leave. At the doorway, Elias quietly spoke. Martha. She looked back. Thank you. For what? For not trying to fix me. She smiled. That was never my job. It belongs to God. She walked upstairs, leaving Elias alone with the fire. He remained there for a long time, staring into the dancing flames. For years, he had believed that opening his heart would only bring more pain. Tonight, he discovered something different. Sometimes, opening a wounded heart was the only way God could begin healing it. Outside, the snow continued to fall across the silent Montana prairie. But inside the Walker Ranch, another storm had finally begun to pass. And though Elias did not yet realize it, the words of a little girl were slowly coming true. Not because Martha had magically erased his sorrow, but because God was using her gentle faith, patient kindness, and steadfast love to help him remember that even the longest winter cannot prevent the coming of spring. Winter did not leave Montana all at once. It surrendered slowly. The towering snowdrifts that had covered the pastures for months began shrinking beneath the warming sun. Frozen streams awakened with cheerful murmurs as ice cracked and drifted downstream. The first blades of green pushed through the brown earth, stubborn and full of promise. Each morning, birds returned to the cottonwood trees surrounding the Walker Ranch. Their songs floated through open windows, replacing the lonely silence that had once settled over the house. Emily declared it the happiest sound in the whole territory. They're singing because winter lost, she announced one morning as she looked out the kitchen window. Martha smiled while kneading bread. Maybe they're thanking God for spring. Emily nodded thoughtfully. I think they're doing both. From the doorway, Elias listened without interrupting. Several months ago he would have walked away. Now he stayed. Not because he had anything to say, but because hearing their conversation somehow made the house feel alive. Spring meant one thing above all else on a cattle ranch: calving season. Every ranch hand rose before sunrise. The barns filled with the soft sounds of newborn calves finding their feet for the first time. Buckets of warm water, fresh straw, and gentle encouragement became part of everyone's daily routine. It was exhausting work. It was also one of the most hopeful seasons of the year. Life was beginning again. Emily insisted on helping wherever she could. She carefully carried small pails of grain, brushed gentle maras, and spoke to every calf as if introducing herself to a new friend. Hello, she whispered to one wobbly brown calf. I'm Emily. You've got very long legs. The calf sneezed. She laughed. I'll take that as hello. Ben Carter chuckled from nearby. I reckon you've made another friend. I think he likes me. I reckon he does. One afternoon, Ben approached Elias as they repaired a section of fencing. You've changed. Elias kept hammering a nail into the post. Have I? Ben leaned on the fence. You don't notice? No. You whistle now. Elias stopped. I do. Not much. But you do. Ben smiled. The men noticed too. Elias looked genuinely surprised. I haven't whistled in years. Exactly. Silence settled between them for a moment. Finally Ben spoke again. I think the Lord's giving something back. Elias rested both hands on the top rail of the fence. I used to think healing meant forgetting. Ben waited. I know now it doesn't. No. It means remembering without drowning. Ben smiled. That's the best thing I've heard you say in a long while. A week later, the annual spring branding brought neighboring ranches together. Families gathered to help one another with the demanding work before sharing a meal afterward. Children played near the barns while adults worked. Emily wandered over to a small pen filled with baby goats that belonged to one of the neighboring ranchers. Their owner, an elderly rancher named Caleb Morrison, laughed as she knelt beside the fence. They're trouble. They're adorable. They're both. One tiny white goat squeezed through a gap in the fence. Emily gasped. Oh. The little creature darted across the yard at surprising speed. Straight toward the branding crew. Catch him, someone shouted. Cowboys laughed as the goat zigzagged between boots, ropes, and water buckets. One man lunged. Missed completely. Another nearly tripped over a saddle. The goat seemed delighted with the game. Emily giggled so hard she could barely breathe. I'm sorry. He won't stop. The little animal raced directly toward Elias. Ben called out, Boss? Behind you. Elias turned just as the goat dashed between his legs. Trying not to step on the tiny creature, he stumbled backward. His boot caught a loose bale of hay. For one unforgettable moment, the proud ranch owner windmilled his arms in the air. He landed squarely in the haystack. A cloud of straw burst into the air. The entire yard fell silent. Everyone stared. Emily covered her mouth. Oh no! The little goat climbed onto the hay bale and bleated triumphantly. Ben's shoulders began to shake. One cowboy snorted. Another burst into laughter. Within seconds, nearly everyone was laughing. They quickly stopped, worried they had gone too far. No one wanted to mock Elias. He had always been respected. The laughter faded into uneasy silence. Then something extraordinary happened. Elias looked at the goat. The goat looked back. It sneezed. A piece of straw landed on Elias's hat. For one brief moment he tried to keep a straight face. He failed. A chuckle escaped. Then another. Before long, deep, genuine laughter filled the yard. Not a polite laugh. Not a forced one. The kind that begins somewhere deep inside and cannot be held back. He laughed until tears filled his eyes. He laughed until he had to wipe his face. He laughed harder than anyone else. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The men simply stared. Ben whispered, "Praise the Lord." Emily's eyes grew wide with joy. "I knew it." She clapped her hands and ran straight toward him. "I told everybody." Still laughing, Elias looked at her. "Told them what?" "My mama could fix your smile." The whole ranch erupted into laughter again. Even Elias couldn't stop smiling. He reached down and gently lifted Emily into his arms. "You were very patient." She wrapped her arms around his neck. "God answered my prayer." He looked into her bright eyes. "Yes. I believe he did." That evening, the ranch celebrated with a simple supper beneath the open sky. Long wooden tables were set outside near the barn. Lanterns hung from fence posts. Fresh biscuits, roasted beef, baked beans, and Martha's famous apple pie filled every plate. Conversation flowed more freely than ever. At one point, Jake stood and raised his coffee cup. "I'd like to make a toast." Everyone looked toward him. "To the boss." Elias looked surprised. Jake grinned. "It's mighty good to have you back." The ranch hands lifted their cups. "To Mr. Walker." Elias stood slowly. For a moment, emotion kept him from speaking. Finally he cleared his throat. "I don't know that I've earned such kindness." Ben interrupted. "You don't have to earn family." Several heads nodded. Elias looked around the table. These men had stood beside him through blizzards, droughts, and heartbreak. Not one of them had walked away. Then he looked toward Martha and Emily. Martha smiled with quiet encouragement. Emily waved enthusiastically. Something stirred deep within him. For years he had believed he was simply surviving. Now he realized he had been loved all along. He had just been too wounded to notice. Later that evening, after everyone else had gone inside, Elias remained on the porch. The sky stretched overhead, filled with countless stars. He heard the screen door open behind him. Martha stepped onto the porch carrying 2 mugs of coffee. "I thought you might like some." "I would." She handed him a mug and sat beside him. For a while neither of them spoke. The peaceful silence between them no longer felt uncomfortable. Finally Martha smiled. "I heard someone laughing today." "So did I. I almost didn't recognize the sound." He chuckled softly. "Neither did I." She looked toward the moonlit pasture. "Emily has been praying for that day." "I know." She never doubted. Elias shook his head with a smile. "I wish my faith were as simple as hers." Martha answered gently. "Faith isn't always simple." "No. No. Sometimes faith is choosing to believe God is still working even when we can't see him." He considered her words. "I spent 7 years believing my story had ended. And now." He looked out across the ranch. "I think." He paused, searching for the right words. "I think maybe it was only one chapter." Martha's eyes softened. "Our lives are like that. We don't always know what God is writing until we turn the page." A cool breeze stirred the porch swing. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang its evening song. Elias looked at Martha. Not as the woman who cooked for his ranch. Not simply as a widow rebuilding her life. He saw her for who she truly was. A woman whose strength came from faith. Whose beauty shone through compassion. Whose presence had quietly transformed every corner of his home, and every corner of his heart. He found himself wondering what life might look like if she never had to leave. The thought surprised him. It also filled him with a quiet peace instead of fear. Before she rose to go inside, Martha smiled. "I should check on Emily." Elias nodded. "Good night, Martha." "Good night, Elias." It was the first time she had called him by his first name. Neither of them mentioned it. But both noticed. Inside the house, Emily peeked through the upstairs window. She had seen Martha step onto the porch with the coffee. She had seen them talking beneath the stars. She folded her little hands together beside her bed. "Dear Jesus," she whispered, "thank you for making Mr. Walker laugh." She smiled sleepily. "And, if it's your plan, could you make him part of our family someday?" She climbed beneath her quilt, completely certain that God had heard every word. Downstairs, Elias remained on the porch long after the lantern had burned low. For the first time in 7 years, he looked toward tomorrow with anticipation instead of dread. The grief that had once defined his life no longer held the final word. Spring had come to the Montana prairie. And, by the grace of God, it had also come to the heart of a lonely rancher who had finally remembered how to smile. Spring settled comfortably across the Montana territory. The rolling hills surrounding the Walker Ranch had turned a rich shade of green, dotted with colorful wildflowers that danced whenever the prairie breeze swept through the valley. The cottonwood trees were once again full of leaves, and every sunrise seemed brighter than the one before. The ranch was thriving. The cattle were healthy. The barns were full. The men worked with renewed energy. Visitors often remarked that there was something different about the Walker Ranch. They couldn't quite explain it. Some thought it was the excellent meals. Others noticed the cheerful conversations around the dinner table. Still others spoke of the peaceful feeling that greeted them the moment they rode through the front gate. Pastor Samuel simply smiled whenever someone mentioned it. "Peace," he would say, "is often the fruit of people who choose to love one another well." Every Thursday evening, the Walker Ranch welcomed neighbors for Bible study. What had begun as a small gathering of 5 people around the dining table had slowly grown until nearly 30 men, women, and children filled the house each week. Martha never sought attention. She simply prepared food, arranged chairs, and made certain everyone felt welcome. Emily greeted each guest as though they were honored visitors. "Come in. We saved you a seat. If you're hungry, there's plenty." Ben laughed one evening. "Miss Emily, you're becoming quite the hostess." She grinned proudly. "My mama says nobody should ever feel like a stranger." Ben smiled. "She's right." That week's Bible study centered on the story of Ruth. Pastor Samuel closed his Bible after reading the final passage. Many people remember Ruth because of her marriage. He looked around the room. But before God gave her a husband, He shaped her character. He turned another page. She was faithful before she was noticed, kind before she was rewarded, patient before her prayers were answered. His eyes rested briefly on Martha. Without embarrassing her, everyone understood why. She lowered her gaze, humbled by the comparison. Elias noticed. He found himself admiring not only her kindness but also her humility. She accepted compliments with gratitude but never sought them. When people praised her cooking, she thanked God. When someone admired the warmth of the house, she thanked everyone who helped. She never placed herself at the center. Instead, she quietly pointed others toward the Lord. The more Elias observed her, the more he understood that true beauty could never be measured by outward appearance alone. It was revealed through faith, compassion, and the way a person treated those around them. Several days later, Martha carried a basket of freshly baked bread toward the bunkhouse. One loaf was wrapped separately. Emily noticed. "Who's that one for?" "Old Mr. Jenkins." "The widower?" "Yes." Emily nodded knowingly. "His hands shake now." "They do. So it's hard for him to bake." Martha smiled. "That's why we're taking him some." As they walked through town, they stopped to greet nearly everyone they met. Children waved. Shopkeepers smiled. Even those who had once judged Martha now welcomed her warmly. Agnes Turner stepped out of the general store carrying a sack of flour. For a moment she hesitated. Then she approached Martha. "Mrs. Bennett?" "Yes." "I owe you an apology." Martha waited quietly. "I spoke unkindly about you. I judged you without knowing your heart." Tears filled Agnes's eyes. "I was wrong." Emily looked at her mother. Martha reached out and gently took Agnes's hand. "Thank you for saying that. I hope you'll forgive me." "I already have." Agnes blinked. "You already have?" Martha nodded. "My Savior has forgiven me far more than anyone could ever do against me." Agnes lowered her head. "You truly are different." Martha smiled. "No. I'm simply trying to become more like Christ." As Agnes walked away, Emily whispered, "Mama?" "Yes." "I think she feels lighter." "So do I." "Is that what forgiveness does?" Martha smiled warmly. "It often does." One Saturday morning, Elias and Martha rode together to inspect a distant pasture. Ben had insisted. You two go. I'll manage things here. Emily happily volunteered to stay behind and help Mrs. Jenkins make strawberry preserves. Before leaving, she looked at Elias with a grin that made him suspicious. You take good care of my mama. I will. And don't forget to tell her she's pretty. Martha nearly dropped her basket. Emily. The little girl giggled and ran toward the kitchen before anyone could respond. Elias laughed. She certainly speaks her mind. She inherited that from her father. There was sadness in Martha's smile. They mounted their horses and rode into the open countryside. The prairie stretched endlessly before them. Wildflowers covered the hills like colorful quilts stitched across the earth. For a long while, they simply enjoyed the peaceful silence. Eventually Elias spoke. May I ask you something? Of course. Were you always this strong? Martha smiled thoughtfully. No. What changed? I stopped asking God why. He looked at her. And started asking him what he wanted to teach me. He considered her answer. That couldn't have been easy. It wasn't. She looked toward the distant mountains. When Thomas died, I was angry. I didn't understand. I prayed. I cried. I questioned everything. She took a slow breath. Then one morning I realized something. What was that? I could spend the rest of my life staring at the door God had closed. Or I could begin walking toward the one he was opening. Elias remained silent. Those words settled deeply within him. What if I'm afraid? She smiled gently. So was I. What if I fail? Then God will still be faithful. He looked at her with quiet admiration. You make faith sound so simple. She laughed softly. It isn't. It's simply worth it. Around midday they stopped beside a crystal-clear stream to eat lunch. Martha unpacked sandwiches, fresh apples and slices of pie. As they ate beneath the shade of an old cottonwood tree, Elias noticed something tucked inside her Bible. A drawing? She smiled. It's Emily's. She carefully unfolded the paper. The crayon drawing showed 3 people standing in front of the Walker Ranch. A tall man wearing a cowboy hat. A woman in a blue dress. A little girl holding both of their hands. Above them she had drawn a large yellow sun. At the top of the page in careful childlike writing were the words, Thank you, Jesus, for my family. Elias looked at the picture for a long moment. Martha. Yes. Does she? He hesitated. Does she think of me as family? Martha folded the drawing carefully. I believe she has for quite some time. He lowered his eyes. I hope that doesn't trouble you. She smiled. No. It frightens me a little. He looked surprised. Why? Because she's teaching me to hope again. The breeze stirred gently around them. For several moments neither spoke. Finally Elias reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. I found this while cleaning Rebecca's sewing room. Martha slowly unfolded it. Inside lay a silver thimble decorated with tiny engraved flowers. It belonged to my wife. Martha looked up, uncertain. I can't accept this. I'm not asking you to replace Rebecca. His voice was steady. I'm thanking you. She remained silent. You've brought life back into this house. You've given Emily a place where she feels safe. You've reminded me that God wasn't finished with me. His eyes grew moist. I couldn't bear looking at that thimble for 7 years. He smiled gently. But now, I think Rebecca would have wanted someone to use it. Tears filled Martha's eyes. She carefully closed her fingers around the little silver thimble. I'll treasure it. I know. That evening they returned to the ranch just before sunset. Emily ran across the yard the moment she saw them. You're back. She hugged her mother first. Then she looked at Elias. Did you tell her? He blinked. Tell her what? That she's pretty. Martha covered her face, laughing. Emily. Elias chuckled. I did. Emily looked at her mother triumphantly. I knew he would. Martha raised an eyebrow. When exactly? Elias smiled warmly. Just now. Everyone laughed. Later that night, after the ranch had grown quiet, Elias stood alone beside the pasture fence. The moon reflected softly across the peaceful valley. He thought about Rebecca. For the first time in years, the memory brought gratitude instead of overwhelming sorrow. She had been God's gift for one season of his life. The years they shared had been precious. Nothing could erase them. Nothing ever would. Then he thought about Martha. She was not Rebecca. She never tried to be. She honored the past without living in it. She carried her own scars with quiet courage. She loved others without asking for anything in return. As he looked toward the warmly lit windows of the ranch house, he saw Martha helping Emily prepare for bed. The little girl laughed at something her mother had said. The sound drifted through the open window. Elias smiled. Then, for the first time since losing his wife, he whispered words he never imagined he would say again. Lord, if it is your will, teach me how to love again. The breeze moved gently through the prairie grass, carrying the sweet scent of wildflowers across the ranch. It felt almost like an answer. Not loud, not dramatic. Just the quiet assurance that the God who had faithfully healed one broken heart was fully able to unite two wounded hearts into one beautiful future. And somewhere upstairs, Emily knelt beside her bed. Dear Jesus, she prayed with a sleepy smile. I think Mr. Walker likes Mama. She paused. I do too. Then she climbed beneath her quilt, completely certain that heaven was smiling. Summer arrived in the Montana Territory with long golden days and cool evenings scented with pine and wild sage. The Walker Ranch had never looked more beautiful. The pasture stretched endlessly beneath brilliant blue skies. Healthy cattle grazed peacefully across the hills, and every fence stood straight after months of careful repairs. The orchard behind the house promised its first full harvest in years, while Martha's vegetable garden overflowed with tomatoes, beans, squash, and herbs. Travelers often remarked that the ranch felt different. Not merely prosperous, peaceful. Pastor Samuel smiled whenever he heard those comments. A peaceful home, he often said, is built long before its walls are finished. It begins with hearts surrendered to the Lord. One evening, as the ranch hands finished supper, Ben Carter leaned toward Elias with a knowing grin. So? Elias looked up from his coffee. So, what? You've been thinking. I usually do. Ben chuckled. Not like this. The other ranch hands exchanged amused glances. Jake finally spoke. Boss. When are you going to ask her? Elias nearly choked on his coffee. I don't know what you're talking about. Laughter spread around the table. Ben folded his arms. You smile every time Mrs. Bennett walks into a room. Jake nodded. You find excuses to help her carry baskets. Another cowboy added, you volunteered to weed the garden. The room erupted with laughter. Ben shook his head dramatically. I've known you 15 years. You've never volunteered to weed anything. Even Elias had to laugh. Perhaps I've changed. Ben smiled warmly. That's exactly the point. That night, Elias sat alone on the porch long after everyone had gone to bed. The stars stretched across the Montana sky like countless tiny lanterns. In his hands rested the worn leather Bible that had belonged to Rebecca. He opened it carefully. Inside the front cover, written in her familiar handwriting, were words he had not read in years. When God closes one season, trust Him with the next. His mercies are new every morning. Elias closed his eyes. He remembered the day Rebecca had written those words. She had smiled and said, Promise me something. What? If the Lord ever asks you to begin again, don't be afraid to obey Him. At the time he had laughed. They were young. They imagined growing old together. Neither of them knew how short their time would be. A tear slipped down his cheek. This time it was not a tear of sorrow. It was gratitude. Thank you, Rebecca, he whispered. And thank you, Lord. The following afternoon, Elias asked Martha if she would ride with him. There's somewhere I'd like to show you. She looked at him curiously. Should I bring anything? He smiled. Just yourself. Emily looked up from feeding the chickens. Can I come? Elias knelt beside her. Not today. She narrowed her eyes playfully. You're planning something. I might be. She grinned. I already know. Martha laughed. What exactly do you know? Emily whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. Mr. Walker gets nervous around you. Martha covered her face. Oh, Emily. Ben, listening from the barn, tried very hard not to laugh. They rode in comfortable silence toward the northern hills. The trail wound through fields of wildflowers until they reached a gentle rise overlooking the entire valley. The view took Martha's breath away. Below them, the Walker Ranch rested peacefully beneath the afternoon sun. It is beautiful, she whispered. Elias nodded. It is. For several moments neither spoke. Finally he took a slow breath. This hill changed my life. She looked at him. I came here the day after Rebecca's funeral. He knelt and gently brushed aside the tall grass. A small wooden cross stood beneath a young cottonwood tree. Fresh wildflowers surrounded it. You've cared for this place. Every week. Martha stood quietly beside him. I used to come here and ask God why. He smiled sadly. I never received the answer I wanted. He looked toward the valley below. But over time, he gave me something better. What was that? His presence. The wind stirred softly through the tall grass. I thought my life had ended. I believed no one could ever understand my heart again. He turned toward Martha. I was wrong. She lowered her eyes. Elias, he gently continued, when you came to the ranch, I noticed your kindness. You saw lonely places and made them welcoming. You saw broken people and reminded them they were loved. You never asked for recognition. You simply served. His voice grew quieter. You even taught me how to remember Rebecca with gratitude instead of guilt. Martha blinked back tears. I didn't do that. God did. He smiled. Through you. For a long moment neither spoke. The silence between them felt sacred. Then Elias reached into his coat pocket. He removed a small velvet box. Martha's eyes widened. Elias. He opened the box. Inside rested a simple gold ring with a tiny sapphire set in the center. It belonged to my grandmother. I had it resized. His voice trembled ever so slightly. I've prayed about this every day. I've asked the Lord to guard my heart if this wasn't His will. He stepped closer. Martha Bennett. You've become my closest friend. You've brought joy back into my home. You've loved this ranch. You've loved the people who live here. And somehow, you've taught a broken rancher how to smile again. Tears streamed down Martha's cheeks. Elias took another breath. I cannot promise there will never be storms. You already know life is not free from sorrow. But I can promise this. I will pray with you. I will honor you. I will cherish Emily as though she were my own daughter. I will walk beside you for as many years as the Lord grants us. He slowly knelt. Martha, will you marry me? For a moment, the only sound was the breeze moving through the prairie grass. Martha covered her mouth with trembling hands. She looked toward the little wooden cross, then toward the valley below. Finally, she looked into Elias's eyes. I prayed for peace before Thomas died. I prayed for strength after he was gone. She smiled through tears. And I prayed that if God ever asked me to love again, He would make it unmistakably clear. She laughed softly. I believe He just did. She nodded. Yes. Yes, Elias. I will marry you. Relief flooded his face. He slipped the ring onto her finger. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then they embraced beneath the wide Montana sky. It was not merely the beginning of a marriage. It was the answer to years of faithful prayer. Back at the ranch, Emily sat on the porch swing with Ben. She kept glancing toward the road. They're taking forever. Ben smiled. Some things shouldn't be rushed. I know. She sighed dramatically. I'm trying to be patient. A few moments later, 2 horses appeared on the distant trail. Emily jumped to her feet. They're coming. As they rode closer, she noticed Martha's hand resting in her lap. Something sparkled in the sunlight. Emily gasped. The ring. Before either horse had completely stopped, she raced across the yard. Mama? Martha barely had time to dismount before Emily threw her arms around her. You said yes. I did. Emily looked at Elias. I knew you were going to ask. You did. She nodded confidently. I've been praying about it. Elias laughed. I should have known. She hugged him next. Does this mean you're really my family now? Emotion caught in his throat. He gently brushed a tear from her cheek. If you'll have me. She smiled so brightly that it seemed to light the entire yard. I've had you for months. Ben quietly turned away to hide the tears filling his own eyes. The wedding took place 3 weeks later beneath the giant cottonwood tree near the edge of the pasture. Neighbors arrived from every direction. Wagons lined the meadow. Children scattered flower petals along the grassy aisle. Wildflowers decorated simple wooden benches built by the ranch hands. Martha wore a modest ivory dress she had sewn herself. The silver thimble Elias had given her rested safely in her sewing basket back at the house, a reminder that honoring the past had helped make this day possible. Emily wore a pale blue dress with a ribbon in her hair. She proudly carried a bouquet of daisies almost as large as her smile. Pastor Samuel stood beneath the cottonwood with his Bible open. He looked at the gathered families. Today we celebrate more than a marriage. We celebrate the faithfulness of God. He smiled warmly at Elias. There was a time when this man believed his story had ended. Then he looked toward Martha. And there was a time when this woman wondered if anyone would ever see beyond her appearance. He turned another page of scripture. But our God delights in writing new chapters. The ceremony was simple, beautiful, filled with scripture, prayer, and quiet joy. When Pastor Samuel declared them husband and wife, Elias looked at Martha with eyes full of gratitude. "You are my answered prayer." She smiled. "And you are mine." As they shared their first kiss as husband and wife, applause echoed across the meadow. Emily clapped harder than anyone. Then, unable to contain herself, she shouted for the whole valley to hear. "I told everybody my mama could fix his smile." The entire gathering burst into warm, joyful laughter. Even Pastor Samuel laughed as he wiped a tear from his eye. Above them, the summer breeze rustled the leaves of the old cottonwood tree. It seemed as though all of creation joined the celebration. The lonely rancher who had not smiled in 7 years now stood hand in hand with the woman God had chosen to help heal his heart. Not because the pain of yesterday had disappeared, but because the grace of God had proven greater than every sorrow. And under the endless Montana sky, surrounded by friends, family, and the love that only heaven could have written, 2 broken lives became one beautiful testimony of God's unfailing faithfulness. 5 years later, the Montana sunrise spilled across the Walker Ranch just as it had thousands of mornings before. Golden light rolled over the green pastures. Hundreds of healthy cattle grazed peacefully beneath the endless western sky. The barns stood freshly painted. The fences were strong. Fruit trees behind the house bent beneath the weight of ripe apples. Fields of wildflowers bordered the long driveway leading toward the ranch house. Travelers who passed by often slowed their wagons simply to admire the place. Some called it the finest ranch in the territory. Others called it the happiest. The people who lived there simply called it home. Inside the kitchen, the day had already begun. Fresh biscuits baked in the oven. The smell of cinnamon and coffee drifted through the open windows. Martha moved around the kitchen with the same quiet grace she had shown from the day she first arrived. She looked much as she always had. Her warm smile greeted everyone. Her faith remained the center of her life. The only difference was the gold wedding band resting comfortably on her finger. Emily, now 12 years old, stood at the table carefully kneading bread. She had grown taller, though her cheerful spirit remained exactly the same. "Mama?" "Yes, sweetheart. Do you think these biscuits are too thick?" Martha smiled. "They're perfect." "They don't look perfect. They were made with love." Emily grinned. "You always say that." "Because it's always true." The back door opened. Elias stepped inside, carrying a basket overflowing with fresh vegetables from the garden. His hat sat slightly crooked and a smear of dirt stretched across one sleeve. Emily laughed immediately. "What happened to you?" He looked down at himself. "I lost an argument with a pumpkin vine." She giggled. "I've never heard of anybody losing to vegetables." "You haven't met these pumpkins." Martha shook her head, laughing. "I'll wash your shirt after breakfast." Elias smiled at her. "I knew marrying you was a good decision." Emily pretended to groan. "There you go again." "What?" "Being sweet." Elias raised an eyebrow. "Is that a problem?" "Only before breakfast." The 3 of them laughed together. Their home was filled with a sound that had once seemed impossible. Joy. Word had spread across Montana about the Walker Ranch. Not because it was the largest. Not because it had the most cattle. But because everyone was welcome there. Widows found work in Martha's sewing room. Travelers never left hungry. Orphans were given clean clothes and warm meals. Young ranch hands who had nowhere to spend Christmas always found a place at the Walker table. Elias had quietly established a tradition. Every Sunday after church, one extra chair remained empty at the dinner table until a stranger filled it. "No one should eat alone," he often said. Ben Carter claimed it was the finest tradition he had ever seen. Thursday evenings remained special. What had begun as a small Bible study around the dining table had grown into something much larger. Neighbors traveled from miles away. Families arrived carrying pies, casseroles, and baskets of fresh vegetables. Children filled the yard with laughter while adults gathered inside to study scripture. Pastor Samuel, though older now, still led the meetings. His voice had softened with age. His faith had only grown stronger. That evening, he closed his Bible after reading from the Gospel of John. "By this everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another." He looked around the crowded room. "I've watched this ranch for many years. I've seen broken hearts healed. I've seen lonely people become family. I've seen forgiveness accomplish what pride never could." He smiled toward Elias and Martha. "This home reminds us that love is not merely spoken. It is lived." Everyone nodded quietly. Some wiped away tears. After Bible study, several children gathered around Emily. She had become known throughout the valley for helping younger children learn to read. Each Thursday she patiently opened the family Bible and practiced simple verses with them. One little boy frowned at a difficult word. "I can't say it." Emily smiled encouragingly. "You can. It looks hard." "So did walking." He looked confused. "You fell down when you learned to walk." He nodded. "But you didn't quit." The boy smiled. "I guess not." "Then don't quit reading either." Nearby, Martha watched with quiet pride. The little girl who had once comforted a lonely rancher was now encouraging an entire generation of children. Later that week, a weary traveler rode through the front gate. His clothes were dusty. His horse looked exhausted. Ben greeted him warmly. "Afternoon." The stranger tipped his hat. "I was told I might find work here." "You've come to the right place." The man looked around in amazement. "I've never seen a ranch quite like this." "What do you mean?" "The men are laughing." Ben chuckled. "They usually are. I've worked plenty of ranches. They're not normally this cheerful." Ben smiled knowingly. "There's a reason." The traveler glanced toward the porch. Elias and Martha sat together shelling peas while Emily read aloud from the Bible. The scene felt almost too peaceful to be real. "What changed this place?" Ben leaned against the fence. "You really want to know?" "I do." Ben nodded toward the porch. 5 years ago, a widow and her little girl arrived with nothing but 2 trunks, a Bible and faith. The traveler listened quietly. "Our boss hadn't smiled in 7 years." "What happened?" Ben laughed softly. "A little girl looked at him outside the church and said..." He paused, smiling at the memory. "My mama can fix that." The traveler smiled. "Did she?" Ben looked toward the porch. Elias had just laughed at something Emily said. His laughter echoed across the yard. Ben's eyes shone with gratitude. "No." The traveler looked puzzled. "No. God did. He simply used a faithful woman and a believing little girl to do it." The traveler removed his hat. "I suppose that's how the Lord usually works." Ben smiled. "Most of the time." That evening, as the sun began to sink behind the mountains, the family walked together toward the northern hill. It had become their custom every anniversary. The path wound through tall grass and blooming wildflowers until they reached the small wooden cross beneath the now mature cottonwood tree. Rebecca's resting place was lovingly cared for. Fresh flowers surrounded the cross. Emily carefully placed a small bouquet of daisies beside it. She had never met Rebecca. Yet every year she insisted on bringing flowers. Martha slipped her hand into Elias's. "I think she would have loved this view." Elias smiled gently. "I think she would have loved both of you." They stood together in quiet reflection. After several moments, Elias spoke softly. "For years, I believed coming here meant remembering loss." He looked across the valley toward the ranch below. "Now it reminds me of God's faithfulness." Martha rested her head lightly against his shoulder. "Love given is never wasted." He nodded. "No, it isn't." Emily looked up. "Can I say something?" "Of course," Elias replied. She folded her hands. "Dear Jesus, thank you for Rebecca. Thank you for Daddy Thomas. Thank you for bringing Mama and Dad together. Thank you for giving us this family. And thank you for answering a little girl's prayer. Amen." Elias felt tears fill his eyes. He looked toward heaven. "Thank you, Lord." That night after supper, the family gathered on the porch as they always did. The air was warm. Crickets sang in the fields. Lantern light flickered gently across the wooden floorboards. Emily rested her head against Elias's shoulder. "Dad." He smiled every time she called him that. "Yes." "Do you remember the first day we met?" "I do." "You looked very serious." "I was." "You hardly talked." "I know." "You looked like you'd forgotten something." He laughed. "I had." "What was it?" He looked toward Martha. Then back at Emily. "Hope." Emily smiled. "I'm glad you found it." "So am I." He wrapped one arm around Martha and the other around Emily. For a long while, they simply watched the stars appear over the Montana sky. No one needed to speak. Some moments were too full for words. Many years later, people across Montana still told the story of the Walker Ranch. They spoke of the generous rancher, the faithful widow, the warm kitchen where no one left hungry, the Bible studies that changed lives, the children who grew up learning that kindness was stronger than cruelty. But most of all, they remembered one little girl. Whenever someone asked how such a remarkable story had begun, the answer was always the same. It started outside a little country church. A lonely rancher stood carrying 7 years of sorrow. A child looked up at him with the kind of faith only heaven can give. And she smiled. Then they would repeat the words that became part of Montana legend. My mama can fix that. Of course, those who knew the whole story always smiled and gently corrected the ending. No. Her mama couldn't. But God could. And He did. Because that is the way our Heavenly Father has always worked. He takes broken hearts and makes them whole. He turns mourning into joy. He gives beauty for ashes. He writes new chapters when we believe the story has ended. He reminds us that true beauty is found in a faithful heart. And sometimes, He begins the greatest miracles with the simple faith of a little child. As the stars shone over the peaceful Montana prairie and laughter drifted from the porch of the Walker Ranch, one truth remained for everyone who passed that way to see. No winter lasts forever. No sorrow is beyond God's reach. And no heart is too broken for the author of life to write a beautiful new ending. The end.